All right, welcome. We're talking about Thanksgiving now. Now, Thanksgiving is a holiday that I can't imagine you haven't thought of or heard of yet, but we're going to delve into the history of Thanksgiving. Now, it was originally a harvest festival, so you grow crops, and at the time when the crops are ready to be taken off the ground so that you can use them, that's called the harvest. And a lot of times it's a massive amount of work, so uh, farmers would work together, and at the end of it, after all that backbreaking labor, they'd get together and they'd have a party, they'd have a festival. But this one was special. This one was between the Pilgrims and the natives. So this was uh, different from the violence that had happened between Native Americans and the settlers in Jamestown. This was a message of peace and prosperity, of working together. And this happened in 1621. So if you remember, the Pilgrims, they had traveled from Plymouth, England, across the ocean. They had intended to go to the Virginia colony, but they got blown off course, and they ended up in New England, and they started a colony called Plymouth. And they came up and they came to Cape Cod, which a cape is like a little hook, and there's very calm water in the middle. They searched around, they landed here at Provincetown, that's where they signed the Mayflower Compact, and then they came over here to Plymouth. And here in Plymouth there was some farmland, and that's where they decided they were going to set up their colony here. And we're going to read about that. So, the most prominent historic Thanksgiving event in American popular culture is the 1621 celebration at the Plymouth Plantation, where the settlers held a harvest feast after a successful growing season. Autumn, or early winter feasts, continued sporadically in later years, first as an impromptu, that means not planned, religious observance, and later as a civil tradition, as a tradition meant to make it where we can remember it. So, the Plymouth settlers, known as Pilgrims, had settled in a land abandoned when all but one of the Patuxet Indians died in a disease outbreak. So, before we move any farther, if you look at the top right of the screen, you will see a series of quotes. Those quotes refer to this time when the Native Americans had abandoned an area and the Pilgrims took over it. So let me read some of these to you. In this bay wherein we live, in former time hath lived about 2,000 Indians. And these were written by the actual Pilgrims. So these are first-hand, primary source accounts. Having their guns and hearing nobody, they entered the Indians' houses and found the people were gone. The sailors took some things and didn't dare to stay. So that is probably when they originally got to Plymouth, and the first time they got off the boat, they saw this village where about 2,000 Indians had been, and they were very cautious because these guys would have heard about Jamestown. They would have heard about the violence. So they're being very careful. They took weapons, guns, and they didn't hear anybody. So this is strange. They go in there, they find some stuff, but they don't find any people. So, we marched to a place we called Cornhill, where we had found the corn below. At another place we had seen before, we dug and found some corn, 2 or 3 baskets full, a bag of beans. It was with God's help that we found this corn. They weren't doing that well. They were hungry. They had just gone across the ocean for 3 months. They were low on supplies. The next morning, we found a place like a grave. We decided to dig it up. We first found a mat, and under that, a fine bow. We also found bowls, trays, dishes, and things like that. We took several of the prettiest things to carry away with us and covered the body up again. So they robbed graves. They must have been desperate indeed. They must have not been in the best condition. They probably were not in a position to fight anyone. If you're robbing graves, you're not exactly rolling in wealth. So let's read on. after a harsh winter killed half of the Plymouth settlers. Ah, that sounds like a reason for desperation right there. The last surviving Patuxent, his name was Squanto. So when you hear about the original Thanksgiving, you will hear Samoset and Squanto. Those are two Native Americans associated with Thanksgiving. Now Squanto, he had learned English and avoided the plague that killed the rest of the Patuxent, the 2,000 Native Americans who would have originally lived where Plymouth is. So he's the only Patuxent to live and survive. That's because he'd been taken to Europe as a slave. He eventually got free and came back and was the only one left. But he also was the only Indian around that spoke English. Squanto was called in at the request of a Native American called Samoset. And Samoset was the first Native American to encounter the Pilgrims. The Wampanoag, the Native American tribe that was the most powerful in this area, they had seen the Pilgrims land, and the chief of the Wampanoag had sent Samoset to check these guys out and to actually talk to them. He's a big, powerful, strong warrior. So Samoset goes there, and he finds out that, yes, these are English. Yes, they speak English. We don't. So he's like, I know a guy who speaks English. Squanto, come on over here. So Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to catch eel and how to grow corn. And he served as an interpreter for them until he too succumbed to the disease a year later. So for about a year, he used his knowledge of English to teach the Pilgrims how to fish for themselves with the local fish and what was locally available, and how to grow corn. The land in this area was not like the land they had left in England, where they had been excellent farmers, but this was different land, different soil, different crops would be needed here. So they were able to learn all this stuff from Squanto. Now, the Wampanoag leader, his name was Massasoit. He also gave food to the colonists during that first winter when supplies brought from England were insufficient. There were supplies sent from England, they weren't enough, and the Wampanoag leader, he gave the Pilgrims enough food to survive. So the Pilgrims celebrated at Plymouth for 3 days after their first harvest in 1621. The first time we've successfully grown food for ourselves. We don't have to be dependent on anyone, and it's because we were taught graciously by Squanto at the behalf of the Wampanoag. The exact time is unknown, but it's thought to have happened around September 29th, and 17th century accounts do not identify this as a springtime occurrence. Rather, it followed the harvest in the fall. So we celebrate Thanksgiving in the fall because we're pretty confident that this was a fall harvest. It included 50 people who were on the Mayflower, all who remained of the 100 who had landed. Remember, 100 Pilgrims originally landed. The first half of them died in that winter when they didn't have enough supplies. And so the 50 that survived met with 90 Native Americans, most likely mostly Wampanoag. The feast was cooked by the 4 adult Pilgrim women who survived their first winter in the New World. Because remember, the Pilgrims, unlike those at Jamestown, they brought full families, which included women and children. Jamestown was all men and boys, and the Pilgrims at Plymouth were much more women, children, men, family units. So the names of these women we actually know: Eleanor Billington, Elizabeth Hopkins, Mary Brewster, and Susanna White. They were helped in cooking this first Thanksgiving meal by their own young daughters and male and female servants. So this would be the first Thanksgiving. I hope you learned something and this helps you out.